It's a pleasure to be here at this conference, which has so many important implications both for science and society. One of the nice things about having a title of a talk like Overview of Research on Memory Distortion is you can basically talk about anything that you want because it's so broad. And I thought that what I would do today is two different things. First is talk very briefly about some of the historical background of research on memory distortion. Beth Loftus told you about the Memory Distortion Conference we had at Harvard earlier this year. And as part of that conference and a volume coming out on it, will be published by Harvard University Press next year, I've written kind of a historical overview of research in this area going back to the 19th century. Those who are interested in it, I'd be happy to send them the chapter. And in your written material, you've got an outline and a lot of the references for the historians in the group. But I'm going to stick to the recent history and talk quite briefly about that. And then what I want to spend most of my time doing is talking about issues concerning the brain and false memory, and how understanding of the way that the brain accomplishes memory may help to illuminate some issues in false memory, because my background is really in memory research is both cognitive and neuroscience, and I want to tell you about some of that work. Okay, historically, the major point that I want to make about work on memory distortion is it has a long history. Psychologists have been interested in this since the turn of the century, when people such as Freud, with his well-known notions of repression and his concerns with issues of confabulation of early traumatic memories, brought these issues to the attention of psychologists. There was a great deal of work on eyewitness testimony at the turn of the century, some early compelling demonstrations of the kind of thing that Beth Loftus just told you about, that people could confidently remember staged events that in fact never happened, most of that work occurring in Germany. In the early 1930s, there was a crucially important event in the historical development of memory distortion research, and this is the publication in 1932 by Sir Frederick Bartlett of his work entitled Remembering. And what Bartlett did in that work was he looked at people's ability to remember stories that were told to them, and he had them recall these events over and over. And what he found was that rather than behaving as a tape recorder, his subjects in fact embellished these stories, recalled them differently on different occasions, and seemed to distort and remember the story very much in line with their own expectations and pre-existing knowledge, what he referred to as schemas. That work kind of went underground for a while, although there are a number of developments that I do talk about in the chapter and that are in the outline. And it wasn't until the 1970s that the work on memory distortion made a comeback. And it wasn't until the 1970s that the work kind of made a comeback with what I refer to in this slide as the rise of constructivism. We saw tremendous outpouring of research with very compelling demonstrations of memory distortions or false memories, basically which made the point that when people make inferences about things at the time of reading a story or witnessing an event, those inferences can later be confused with memories. And a whole line of researchers provided strong evidence along those lines in kind of a heyday of memory distortion research in the 70s. More work on eyewitness testimony, and that's when Beth Loftus' important experiments on misleading post-event information that you just heard about got going. The 1980s was an extraordinarily productive time in memory research for many reasons. And there were a number of topics that were really first brought into sharp focus then that I think are crucial for understanding memory distortion at both the psychological level and at the level of the brain. Work on reality monitoring, how people distinguish between fantasies, imaginings, and external events, as you just heard in Dr. Loftus' talk. Crucial issue in memory distortion was really brought into focus by the work of Marcia Johnson, now at Princeton University, and her colleagues as they began to show the conditions under which people could become confused about internal imaginings on the one hand and external events on the other, and started to delineate some of the psychological processes that are involved that allow us, under many, if not all conditions, to distinguish between real and imagined events. Another phenomenon, related phenomenon, was brought into focus into focus and wide attention for the first time in the 80s, and this is the related phenomenon of source memory. How do we remember the conditions under which something happened to us? How do we remember the context of an event? How do we remember whether something was just told to us or we actually witnessed the event? And it was shown in some work that we and others did in the 1980s, and I'll get back to this with respect to the brain a little bit more in a few minutes, that patients with certain kinds of brain damage were able to hold on to certain facts that one would teach them. You could teach them novel facts of various kinds, but they would forget about where they learned these facts. For example, you ask the patient who has a memory problem, what job did Bob Hope's father have? They don't know. We make up an answer and tell them, oh, he was a fireman. They say, oh, that's very interesting. A minute later, he asks them, by the way, do you know what job Bob Hope's father had? They say, oh, yeah, I know. He was a fireman. Say to the patient, well, how do you know that? Correct response would be, you just told me a minute ago. And what they will frequently say is, oh, I read about it in the newspaper. Oh, I'm just guessing. I saw it on television. That's a phenomenon referred to as source amnesia. You hold on to the factual content of an event, but you lose the context. And it turns out, as various studies have shown, that all of us are susceptible to source amnesia at very long delays. We lose source information. Now, when that happens, one then becomes susceptible to the various kinds of memory distortions that we heard about a few minutes earlier. Some, if not all, of the distortions that Beth Loftus told you about result from confusing contexts. And once we move far away from an event, we all become subject to source amnesia. And I think an important point that emerged in the 80s through the work of people like Steve Lindsay, who we'll talk later today, is that there are a variety of memory distortion phenomena that indeed result from source memory. When you lose source information, you become subject to various kinds of memory distortions. Work on implicit and explicit memory makes a related point. Implicit memory refers to our kind of non-conscious memory for past events that we can't recollect consciously. It's something I've worked on extensively. Larry Squire will tell you a little bit more about it later. We've learned that indeed there are instances in which people can lose their explicit recollection of an event, but their behavior can still be influenced by that event, their behavior and performance. This is relevant to memory distortion for a couple of reasons. Number one, again, implicit memory by definition involves loss of source information, and people may retain vague feelings, preferences that have been put there by past events that they can't remember, but provide a basis perhaps for constructing inaccurate memories under suggestive influence. Second, it's been suggested, particularly by some therapists, that one way to distinguish between true recovered memories, the real ones that people recover of actual traumatic events, and falsely created memories is that the true recovered memories were always preceded by unconscious symptoms that relate to the traumatic event. This turns out to be kind of a complex issue that I won't have time to get into, but it's one way in which work on implicit and explicit memory is relevant to the issue of memory distortion. A major development in psychology in the 1980s involved the development of what people refer to as connectionist or PDP models, parallel distributed processing models. These are models of how the brain accomplishes memory and cognition, and they involve the concept of neural networks. The crucial point for our purposes is that in these models, which are now really the dominant models in the psychology and cognitive neuroscience of memory and cognition, memories aren't stored the way they would be in a video camera as little snapshots of events. Rather, they're all superimposed on one another. There's distributed storage, and some of the same structures and processes are used to store different memories. In other words, in these kinds of models, memory distortion emerges as a very natural consequence of the way memory works. Of course, memory is basically and often accurate. It's got to be in order to have evolved to serve the functions that it does for us. But in these kinds of models, we can see how certain kinds of memory distortions emerge from the basic architecture of memory. 1980s also saw an upsurge of research on hypnosis and memory, and basically compelling demonstrations that if you want to create a false memory, there's no better way to do it than to put someone under hypnosis. Hypnosis does not increase the accuracy of memory, this research showed. Rather, what it does is it basically increases people's willingness to call any mental event a memory, along the lines of what Beth Loftus was talking about. And during the 80s, we also saw an upsurge in research on the effects of emotion on memory and traumatic memory. Questions of flashbulb memories, like remembering where you were when the Challenger explosion occurred, or remembering where you were when Kennedy was shot. And through the work of Neisser and others, it became clear that these memories are not always as accurate as we would believe them to be. Partly because of source amnesia. People can confuse sources and confuse context of where they were, but they can hold with great subjective conviction inaccurate memories, even about highly emotional event. And that's a very active area now. Conditions under which emotional memories are accurate, and by and large they tend to be, but there are conditions under which they can be subject to distortion. And all of this research now is carried on into the 90s, but with heightened interest and attention because of all the debates and discussions that are well known to everybody here. Okay, now I want to talk about the brain and memory, because I think that those of us who study memory from the perspective of brain systems have the potential to offer something useful and interesting to our understanding of true and false memories. If we're going to ever resolve the situation that is before us now, one of the things we're going to need to know is, both at the psychological level and at the brain level, how accurate and inaccurate true and false memories differ from each other, and what the mechanisms of them are. And I think that what I'm going to try to convince you is that there are pathways to this understanding through the analysis of how the brain accomplishes memory. Okay, there's a brain. Larry Squire is going to tell you later on that one of the most important structures for memory and learning is known as the medial temporal lobe. The medial temporal lobe, do I have a pointer up here? I
think you're better off using your finger.
Okay. I'm not going to do that again. The temporal lobes sit here on the lateral surface of the brain. And if we could look inside the temporal lobes, we go inside the temporal lobes to the medial regions, the inner regions, there are a number of structures there, including the hippocampus and related structures, that are crucially important for our ability to remember recent events. We have damage in those medial temporal structures. Thank you, Larry. If we have damage in those medial temporal structures, we have a devastating impairment of memory. It's known as the amnesic syndrome, and we lose our ability to remember recent events. For our purposes, however, the interesting structure I want to focus on is not the medial temporal system, which Larry will tell you about in more detail, but rather the vast expanse at the front of the brain known as the frontal lobes. People who have damage to the frontal lobes, particularly a region known as the prefrontal cortex, aren't amnesic. They don't lose their ability to remember what they had for breakfast yesterday, or lose their ability to remember where they spent their summer vacation, as amnesic patients do. They have more subtle problems with memory. They may have difficulty organizing retrieval strategies. They have difficulties monitoring their memory impairment. But what's interesting and relevant to today's discussion is that people with damage to the frontal lobes exhibit a number of different false memory phenomena that we think implies that in the normal course of events, the frontal lobes are playing a critical role in helping us with keeping our memories accurate. Let me tell you what I mean by that. I want to review basically three kinds of memory distortions or false memory phenomena that seem to be related to frontal lobe dysfunction. Number one is our friend source amnesia that I just talked about. In the experiment that I told you about, in which we try to teach some memory disordered patients that Bob Hope's father was a fireman, it turned out that the patients who were most susceptible to source amnesia, that is, later coming up with that fact, but getting the source wrong, were patients who, in addition to some medial temporal damage that caused amnesia, were patients who had frontal lobe damage. Those are the ones who had great difficulty remembering source information. It's since been shown in some work in Squire's lab that damage to the frontal lobes alone, which doesn't produce severe amnesia, nevertheless can produce severe difficulties with source memory. That when you have damage up in the frontal lobes, you lose the connection between the factual content of the event and the source. In other research that we and other people have conducted with elderly adults, we found that as we get older, we can become quite susceptible to source amnesia, and the extent to which we as older adults exhibit source amnesia is related to some indices of frontal lobe dysfunction. Elderly adults who do poorly on various tests that are sensitive to deterioration in the frontal lobes tend to be the ones who show a lot of source amnesia. And interestingly, young children show, under a variety of conditions, lots of source amnesia, and there's a case to be made that young children are specifically characterized by immature frontal lobe functioning, something I've discussed in a recent article. So there's a strong link there between frontal lobe function and source amnesia that tells us that frontal lobes are doing something important in the normal course of events in keeping sources and contents together. Confabulation refers to detailed false narratives that brain damage patients will sometimes produce about events that never happen. The basic difference between them and normal subjects who don't have brain damage is that you don't need suggestion to get these false narratives going. They will tell you all kinds of stories about events in their lives that never happen. Again, it seems to be pretty consistent that confabulating patients exhibit damage to certain areas in prefrontal cortex. That's what gets the confabulation going. They seem to lose, among other things, the ability to monitor the accuracy of their memory performance. Third phenomenon I want to tell you about in a little bit more detail is known as false recognition. And I'm going to do this by telling you about a recent case study that my colleagues and I, mainly Tim Curran and Harvard, have conducted with a patient who has damage to the frontal lobes and exhibits an interesting kind of false memory or false recognition phenomenon. The patient is a 65-year-old man who we refer to by the initials BG. This is a CAT scan. He had a stroke in his right hemisphere. You can't see it terribly well here, but we're looking at a slice of his brain, ascending slices, and there's a dark area here. Left is right and right is left, consistent with radiological practices, but there's a very dark area here that is where he had his stroke, and it basically has incapacitated his right frontal lobe. One reason why that was interesting to us is there's mounting evidence from brain scanning research on memory that the right frontal lobes are doing something very important in memory retrieval as opposed to encoding information into memory. Nobody yet knows quite what, but we and others have started to study right frontal patients because we're interested in figuring out what that right frontal region is doing. We did a very simple experiment with BG to look at his memory. We showed him a bunch of familiar words, and some of those words we had him study by a very low-level encoding task where he just counts the number of T-junctions in a word. How many places are there in a word that two lines cross? It's a standard encoding task that psychologists use that typically produces poor memory. Other words we would show him and say, how much do you like these words? That's known in cognitive psychology as a deep or elaborative encoding task and typically produces good memory. So there are just two ways to get him to study a list of words that we present to him. Then, after a few minutes delay, we present to him a recognition test, a remember no recognition test. I'll tell you what that's about in a minute. And there are 24 words that he studied earlier and made liking ratings about, 24 words that he made T-junctions ratings about, and 24 non-studied words that never appear on the list and are not related to words that appear on the list. And what we ask BG and control subjects to do is to tell us first, do you think the word was on the list? Yes, if you think it was on the list, if you remember it, no, if you don't. And then we use a technique that's been around in the literature for a number of years now that allows us to get a little bit of a better qualitative feel for what that mental experience is like at the time of retrieval. It's called the remember no judgment. So and this is just an excerpt from the instructions. We tell him to write down R, remember, if you specifically remember seeing the word during the liking or T-junction task. You only say remember when you encounter a word that evokes a specific recollection of something that happened or something you experienced when the item was previously shown. We give a variety of examples. So that's when you really remember it. We say to mark no if the word just seems familiar. For example, if you run into someone on the street and you say, gee, who are you? Your face seems familiar. You can't remember who they are. That's knowing the person but not remembering any specific incident. So we say if it just seems familiar, write down no. And if you don't think the word was on the list, write down new. Something very interesting happened in this experiment. What I'm showing you here are the proportion of remember responses and no responses made by BG and a set of 8 matched controls to words that were never on the study list. They were never shown before. So the correct answer here is that these words are all new. Now what's interesting about BG is that about 40% of the time he's claiming these words were on the list, A, and B, he's claiming that he remembers them. It's not just that he knows them, they seem familiar. He's saying, oh yeah, I remember that word, it was on the list. The only problem is it wasn't. As you can see, normal controls here will only claim to remember items that weren't on the list 5% of the time, and this bar shows the highest false alarmer among the 8 controls. People tend not to false alarm all that much under these conditions where there's no association between the words on the study list and the test words. He gives about the same number of no responses. Well, you might say maybe BG just likes to use the remember response for some reason. Turns out not to be true, because if you look at his response to studied items, so these are words that really were on the list, he's pretty much like the controls in his use of the remember and no responses. If anything, in this task, he actually does it somewhat less than the control subjects. But it's not just that he likes to use the remember response. He's really convinced that these items are on the list. We've done about a dozen experiments with BG now, and we find that he will exhibit this false memory phenomena in the auditory domain, the visual domain. He'll do it with pseudo words, that if we make up words that he's never seen before in his life, nonsense words, he'll still claim to remember having seen them in the study list. He'll do it with sounds. He'll do it in just about every circumstance you can imagine. But we have figured out a way that we can shut him down. We can stop him from false alarming. We think this gives us some clues as to what's going on here, and also to possibly what that right frontal region might be doing in memory that relates to these phenomena of memory distortion. Here's how we can shut BG down. We do an experiment in which we show him pictures of objects, one at a time. And they come from different categories. So for example, you can see here, this all comes from the category of furniture. And there are other categories thrown in as well. Later on, we give him a recognition test. Some of the pictures, again shown one at a time, some of the pictures were shown before, and then there are new pictures that weren't shown before. Some, like a couch, come from this category. Okay? He never saw it before, but he saw other items of furniture. Others, like an anchor, are inanimate objects, like all the ones he saw were, but don't come from the category. And then others are animals. He never saw any animals. He never saw any animate objects at all. Will he do his false alarming to any or all of these? And what we find here, these are just BG's data, is basically he false alarms like crazy, claiming to remember items if they came from the category that he studied. He'll say, oh yeah, I remember that couch, even though he never saw a couch. But he doesn't do it hardly at all if items don't come from a studied category. So he won't just wantonly false alarm to anything. What does this mean? Well, what we think it means is that BG's problem arises because he is responding inappropriately to kind of a coarse match between some of the test items and what he's studied before. He's misinterpreting the general correspondence between some test items and what he's seen before as evidence that he actually saw that item. And we think he's not carrying out the search and monitoring processes that you need to avoid these false memory responses. Therefore, he false alarms. So there's some suggestion that right frontal lobes might be involved in carrying out, as others have argued on the basis of different data, some of these search and monitoring functions that allow us to distinguish between true and false memories. Of course, this is not to suggest that people people in therapy or otherwise who have false memories have anything wrong with their frontal lobes. It's simply to say that the fact that frontal lobe damaged patients exhibit this kind of phenomenon tells us that the frontal lobes are crucial for carrying out the functions that ordinarily allow us to distinguish between true and false memories. Okay, let me finish up now by telling you about one further study that we've done with a different kind of neurological population that we think also gives us a little more leverage into distinguishing and pulling apart different kinds of false memory phenomena. This is an experiment that we conducted with amnesic patients, and we used a procedure that was first developed by Deese back in 1959 to induce kind of memory distortions or false memories in normal subjects. It's been rediscovered recently by Roddy Roediger at Rice University and Don Reed in Canada. And let me just give you a demonstration of this, which seems appropriate enough at this conference. I'm going to engage with subjects in a very brief memory experiment. I want you to remember the following words: candy, sour, sugar, bitter, good, taste, tooth, nice, honey, soda, chocolate, heart, cake, eat, pie. Everyone, I'm sure, can repeat those back to me with no problem. I do want you to just take a few seconds to write down the words that you remember from the list. Time is running short, so I'm going to cut you off. Now I'm going to give you a little recognition test. I just want you to write down, don't raise your hands yet, just tell me if you remember this word being on the list. And further, we did the remember no procedure. Tell me, do you actually remember having heard the word before? Does it just feel familiar? Taste, write it down. Light, write it down. Sweet, write it down. Okay, we'll tabulate the data now. How many people said yes to taste? Did you think it was on the list? So most, maybe half, a little more than half. How about light? Nobody. And how about sweet? You've all just experienced a false memory. Just out of curiosity, how many people claim to have remembered sweet? You now understand why we have a problem that we're talking about. Needless to say, sweet was not on the list. This is how you turn normal subjects into our friend BG. You give them a lot of associations, you take out the prototype, and you believe later on that it was on the list. So you all know what a false memory feels like. It can be pretty compelling. Well, let me just tell you, even though I've only got a minute left here, we're going to have the slides off. You can just turn the slides off, please. Yeah. We did an experiment just like this with amnesic patients. These are patients that have damage to the medial temporal lobes and don't remember much about their past experiences. We wanted to know whether they would be subject to false memories. And we've run 11 out of 12 amnesics, 11 out of 12 controls, but the data are pretty clear, and I wanted to show them to you because I think they make a nice point about the different bases one can have for false memories. We basically did the experiment, a couple of conditions, more or less like I just did with you. They get one of these lists, sometimes they have to recall it, sometimes they wouldn't, and there are about 20 or so of the list that we use. Later on, we give them the same recognition test that I gave to you. And we ask, what is their hit rate? Okay, how often did they say yes to words that really were on the list, like taste was on the list? And control subjects have a much higher hit rate than amnesic patients. That's why amnesic patients are amnesic. They don't remember very often. Now let's look at non-critical false alarms. That's like the word light that I gave to you. It has no relationship to the words that are in the study list. And what you find is pretty typical finding here. with amnesic patients and controls, amnesics have a higher false alarm rate, okay? They don't discriminate very well between old and new items. 51% hit rate, 31% false alarm rate, whereas controls discriminate very well, 83% hit rate, 25% false alarm rate. And this is typical. People with a low hit rate typically have a high false alarm rate. They just don't discriminate very well, and they more or less haphazardly. The question becomes, what about the critical false alarms? What about sweet? Everybody here thought it was on the list. Will amnesic patients show more false alarms than control subjects as they do with the non-critical false alarms? Well, what happens with controls? 89%. So they actually false alarm more to sweet. The false memory is actually here a little more prevalent than the correct memory, and I think that was true in our demonstration. But interesting, with amnesic patients, we find a much lower critical false alarm rate, although they too provide more false alarms than, provide more yes responses to critical new items than to old items. What does this say? This crossover interaction, amnesics false alarm more for these kinds of words, not for these. Well, it simply tells you that that critical false alarm phenomenon depends on having some memory for at least the gist of what happened. It's a carryover of memory that amnesic patients don't have. So here, you've got to have good memory. You've got to have some memory for the event in order to show the false memory. And interestingly, the same pattern prevails when you look only at the remember responses. You knock out the ones they claim to know. These are the ones they're claiming to remember. Hit rate for controls is much higher than amnesics. Non-critical false alarm rate, people hardly ever claim to remember these. And then control subjects are claiming to remember these much more often than amnesic patients. So by using different kinds of neuropsychological patients, we can now start to get a leverage on teasing apart different kinds of false memories and false alarm responses. So in closing, I would say that I think that psychological and neuropsychological research on memory distortion has a lot to offer us in terms of understanding some of the basic mechanisms that are involved in false memory. And I think that with all the awareness and attention that has been brought to this issue by the plight of so many people, that this will probably stimulate further research in the future. And hopefully this research is not only going to advance our scientific understanding, but will also have some beneficial feedback to society. Thank you.